Jack Lawson knew invisibility had a uniform: black suit, pressed white shirt, leather gloves that gripped the wheel, while his daughter watched from school pickup lines, her eyes holding questions she never asked. The words, "You're just a driver," the boss laughed, echoed through the hangar, when the private jet refused to fly, when engineers stood baffled, when his employer's contempt felt like oxygen, everywhere, suffocating. Then Jack fixed the jet engine that stumped all the engineers, and the silence that followed tasted like vindication his daughter had been waiting 15 years to witness. The steering wheel was warm beneath Jack Lawson's palms, the leather worn smooth by 5 years of circular motion, of waiting, of existing in the negative space between destinations that mattered to everyone but him. He sat in the idling black sedan outside Whitfield Industries headquarters, the engine purring with the kind of quiet precision that reminded him of machines that knew their purpose, unlike the man who drove them. The Chicago skyline pressed against the windshield, glass towers reflecting afternoon sun in ways that made him squint, made him think of Chloe's science fair project about light refraction, about how things appeared bent when they weren't, about how perception could lie with geometric certainty. His daughter understood physics better than most adults understood kindness, and he wondered if she'd inherited that from him or from necessity, from watching her father become furniture in other people's stories. The radio hummed something forgettable, corporate smooth jazz that filled silence without challenging it, and Jack's mind wandered to the stack of textbooks hidden in his apartment closet, aeronautical engineering volumes he'd collected from library sales and used bookstores, pages dog-eared and annotated in margins that contained equations he'd never stopped solving. He'd been 23 when Chloe's mother left, when the scholarship to MIT became a memory he folded away like old photographs, when fatherhood became the only engineering project that mattered, the only structure he'd build with his bare hands and breaking heart. The passenger door opened with the kind of decisive click that announced importance before the person even appeared, and Mr. Whitfield slid into the back seat with the graceless entitlement of someone who'd never questioned whether spaces were meant for him. He smelled like expensive cologne and leather briefcase, like board meetings and merger negotiations, like the kind of confidence that came from never being told no in any language that mattered. Jack caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, 60 years old but looking 50, silver hair styled with precision, suit tailored to hide the softness that came from decades of restaurant meals and country club lunches. "Airport," Whitfield said without greeting, without acknowledgement that another human being occupied the front seat, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone giving commands to voice-activated technology. Jack nodded once, shifted into drive and pulled into Michigan Avenue traffic with the smooth efficiency that made him good at a job designed to make him invisible. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable but practiced, a script they'd performed hundreds of times, employer and employee, master and servant, man who mattered and man who moved him from place to place like cargo with a heartbeat. Chloe had asked him once during breakfast before school why he let Mr. Whitfield talk to him like furniture, and Jack had stirred his coffee slowly, watching cream spiral into dark liquid like galaxy formations, buying time to find words that wouldn't sound like defeat. "Respect is complicated," he'd told her finally, knowing it was insufficient, knowing she deserved better than platitudes that tasted like surrender. Sometimes you have to choose between being right and being employed, between pride and paying rent, between showing someone who you are and making sure your daughter has everything she needs. Chloe had looked at him with those eyes that were too old for 15, eyes that had watched him absorb contempt like radiation, slow and accumulating, and she'd simply nodded. But something in that nod felt like judgment, like disappointment, like love mixed with the bitter awareness that her father had made himself small so she could grow. The memory sat heavy in Jack's chest as he navigated traffic, as Whitfield made phone calls in the back seat about quarterly earnings and hostile takeovers, voice rising and falling with the rhythm of someone conducting an orchestra of money and power. Jack had learned to tune it out, to let the words become background noise, white static that filled the car without penetrating his consciousness. But today, something felt different. A tension in his employer's voice, an edge of genuine concern that cut through the usual performative aggression. "The jet better be ready," Whitfield said suddenly, directing the comment to whoever was on the phone. But Jack heard it clearly, heard the worry beneath the demand. "I don't care what it costs, get it fixed. This meeting in New York can't be rescheduled. Jacobson will pull out of the merger if I'm not there by 6, and I'm not losing a $400 million deal because of mechanical issues." Jack's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the steering wheel, his mind automatically cataloguing information. Private jet, mechanical problem, time-sensitive, high stakes. He'd seen Whitfield's Gulfstream once, had driven past the private hangar at Chicago Executive Airport during a parts delivery for another client, had noted its sleek lines and powerful engines with the kind of appreciation most people reserve for art. Aircraft had always fascinated him, the elegant marriage of physics and engineering, the way metal and fuel and mathematics could achieve something as impossible as flight, as beautiful as defying gravity through pure calculated force. His MIT scholarship had been for aerospace engineering specifically, a full ride that came with research opportunities and professor mentorship, and a future that had seemed inevitable until Chloe arrived, tiny and screaming and utterly dependent. And suddenly, the future had rearranged itself around diaper changes and pediatrician appointments, and the mathematics of survival rather than the mathematics of thrust ratios. The drive to the airport took 35 minutes through traffic that moved like cold honey, sluggish and frustrating, while Whitfield made 3 more calls, each one more tense than the last, his confident veneer cracking to reveal genuine anxiety underneath. Jack understood that anxiety in ways his employer never would. The fear of things falling apart, of carefully constructed plans collapsing, of being powerless against circumstances that refuse to cooperate with your timeline or your importance. But Whitfield's anxiety came from potentially losing money, from missed opportunities and damaged reputation, while Jack's had always been about keeping the lights on, about Chloe's school supplies and winter coats that fit, about the grinding daily terror of one unexpected expense, destroying the careful balance between paycheck and survival. They were both afraid, he supposed, but their fears lived in different universes, spoke different languages, carried different weights that couldn't be compared without acknowledging the obscene distance between them. When they finally pulled into Chicago Executive Airport and drove past the main terminal toward the private hangars, Jack could see the Gulfstream sitting on the tarmac like a grounded bird, surrounded by men in coveralls and reflective vests, their body language spelling frustration in a universal dialect that needed no translation. Whitfield was out of the car before Jack could fully stop, moving with urgent purpose toward his jet, toward his problem, toward the mechanical failure that threatened his schedule and ego in equal measure. Jack was supposed to wait. That was his job, his function, to be ready when needed and absent when not. But something pulled him from the driver's seat, some old instinct that hadn't died despite 5 years of deliberate burial. He walked slowly toward the hangar, keeping distance, maintaining his invisible status, but close enough to hear voices rising in frustration, engineers arguing about diagnostic results and possible causes, their technical language washing over him like a familiar song in a language he'd once spoken fluently. Chloe would be getting out of school in 3 hours, would text him asking if he'd be home for dinner, and he'd respond with the same careful optimism he always did, the same promise that tonight would be different, that tonight they'd eat together and talk about her day, about her classes, about anything except the fact that her father spent his life waiting in cars for men who didn't know his daughter's name. But standing there at the edge of the hangar, watching engineers fail to solve a problem that sang to something deep in his trained mind, Jack felt something stir that he'd thought was gone. Not hope exactly, but something closer to recognition. Like seeing your reflection after years of avoiding mirrors, like remembering you once had a face. Mr. Whitfield's voice carried across the hangar with the particular quality of wealthy frustration, sharp and demanding, expecting the universe to reorganize itself around his needs through sheer force of entitlement. I don't want excuses. I want solutions. This jet needs to be airborne in 90 minutes, or heads will roll, contracts will be terminated, and someone's career will end before dinner. The engineers exchanged glances that Jack recognized from his own past, the look of competent professionals dealing with incompetent authority, the exhausting dance of knowing more than the person paying you while having to pretend their panic was justified. There were 5 of them, clustered around the open engine compartment, diagnostic tablets glowing with data streams and sensor readings, tools spread across portable workbenches with the organized chaos of people who'd been troubleshooting for hours without breakthrough. The lead engineer, a woman in her 40s with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, tried to explain again with admirable patience. Mr. Whitfield, we've run every diagnostic available. Fuel systems check out, hydraulics are perfect, electrical is clean. The engine simply won't maintain stable combustion at high RPM. Something's causing harmonic instability, but the sensors aren't identifying any obvious mechanical failure. Her words were precise and professional, but Jack heard the frustration underneath. The knowing that came from expertise meeting mystery, from doing everything right and still getting wrong results. Whitfield waved her explanation away like smoke, like something insubstantial and annoying, his face reddening with the kind of anger that came from impotence dressed as authority. I didn't hire you to tell me what you can't find. I hired you to fix my airplane. Do I need to call your supervisor? Do I need to find engineers who actually understand their jobs? The words landed like slaps, public humiliation delivered with casual cruelty, and Jack watched the lead engineer's jaw tighten, watched her swallow whatever response wanted to emerge, watched her professional composure hold against personal insult because bills needed paying and arguments with wealthy clients were luxuries she couldn't afford. It was a dance Jack knew by heart, had performed countless times in the front seat of the sedan, the choreography of swallowed dignity, the careful performance of deference that protected employment at the cost of self-respect. He taught himself not to react, not to show emotion, to treat contempt like weather, something external and temporary that you simply endured until it passed. But watching it happen to someone else, watching this competent engineer absorb verbal abuse for the crime of not performing miracles on demand, something in Jack's chest tightened with familiar rage, with the accumulated weight of 5 years of similar moments. Chloe had stopped asking him about his day last year, had stopped probing for details about work, and Jack suspected she'd figured out that his days were strings of small humiliations he'd rather not recount over dinner. She was smart like that, his daughter, emotionally intelligent in ways that made him ache with pride and guilt in equal measure, aware that sometimes love meant not asking questions that forced comfortable lies. He thought about her now, standing at the edge of this hangar, watching grown men and women scramble around a problem they couldn't solve while their employer treated them like disappointing appliances. What would she think if she saw him here in his driver's uniform, maintaining his careful invisibility, while people with advanced degrees struggled with machinery he understood instinctively? Would she be proud that he knew his place, that he protected his job by staying silent and separate? Or would she be disappointed that her father had stopped being who he was, had folded himself away so completely that even brilliance had become something to hide, something that might threaten the careful stability they'd built from minimum wage and self-erasure? The engineers huddled together, voices low, debating next steps with the urgency of people running out of options and time. Jack moved closer, not consciously deciding to, but drawn by professional curiosity that hadn't died despite years of deliberate starvation. He could see into the engine compartment from this angle, could see the turbine assembly with its hundreds of precisely machined blades, could see the combustion chamber and fuel injectors, could see the elegant complexity that made flight possible through controlled explosion and directed force. His eyes tracked along the turbine automatically, following blade configurations, noting angles and clearances, seeing the system as a whole rather than isolated components the way mechanics were trained to see. There was a rhythm to engines, a visual music that spoke in harmonics and resonance, in the mathematics of rotation and heat and pressure. And Jack had learned to read that music before he'd learned to read his daughter's moods, before he'd learned that intelligence without opportunity was just another form of suffering. Maybe we should ground it completely and get a replacement part flown in from the manufacturer, one of the younger engineers suggested, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone proposing surrender. The lead engineer shook her head, checking her watch with visible stress. That's a minimum 48-hour turnaround, probably longer given the holiday weekend. Mr. Whitfield made it very clear that's not acceptable. She said his name with careful neutrality, but Jack heard the subtext. Whitfield would make their lives miserable, would possibly terminate contracts, would wield his wealth like a weapon against people whose only crime was confronting physical reality that didn't care about merger deadlines. Jack had lived adjacent to wealth for 5 years now, had watched how it warped behavior and expectation, how it created a bubble of manufactured reality where problems were supposed to dissolve through sheer force of money and anger. Whitfield genuinely believed his importance should override physics, should make mechanical failures apologize and correct themselves, should bend the material world through social hierarchy and financial pressure. Jack's eyes caught something then, a hairline irregularity in one of the turbine blades, so thin it barely registered, a shadow within a shadow that spoke to stress fractures and metal fatigue. He stepped closer unconsciously, his driver's uniform suddenly feeling like a costume, like something borrowed that didn't quite fit, and his mind was already calculating blade rotation speeds, resonance frequencies, the way a single compromised blade could create harmonic instability that cascaded through the entire combustion system without triggering obvious sensor alerts. It was elegant in a terrible way, the kind of failure that required understanding systems as living wholes rather than mechanical parts, required seeing how components talk to each other in languages of vibration and heat and stress. The engineers were good. He could see that in their methodology, their systematic approach, but they were thinking like mechanics, like troubleshooters trained to find discrete failures, while this problem required thinking like a designer, like someone who understood the philosophical architecture of how engines breathed and sang and occasionally whispered their own mortality. Jack had been that kind of thinker once, before fatherhood had required him to become something smaller, something more practical, something that could fit inside a driver's uniform without bursting at the seams with unused knowledge and carefully buried dreams. "Sir, you need to step back. This is a restricted work area," one of the younger engineers said, finally noticing Jack's presence at the edge of their crisis, his voice carrying automatic authority that came from wearing the right clothes, from belonging to the tribe of people who touched expensive machinery professionally. Jack should have apologized, should have retreated to the car and his designated invisibility, should have remembered that drivers didn't belong in conversations about turbine harmonics and resonance frequencies. But something had shifted inside him, some long-dormant instinct that remembered who he'd been before life had required strategic forgetting, before his MIT acceptance letter had become something he hid in a drawer like evidence of a crime. He looked at the young engineer with steady eyes, not challenging but not retreating either, and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone stating observable fact rather than opinion. "The harmonic resonance is off," Jack said, his voice carrying none of the deference usually required from people in his position. Third turbine blade, second stage compressor. There's a hairline fracture causing irregular oscillation at high RPM. The blade still structurally sound enough to pass static diagnostics, but once you introduce high-speed rotation and thermal stress, it creates cascade instability in the combustion cycle. The silence that followed was profound and strange, heavy with the weight of displaced expectation, and Jack watched 5 sets of eyes turn toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation to something that might have been curiosity. Whitfield appeared from the jet's interior, having overheard the exchange, his face already arranging itself into the particular sneer he reserved for people who forgot their place in his carefully ordered universe. "Jack, what are you doing?" His tone carried multiple layers of meaning. Surprise that his driver had wandered from the car, confusion that said driver was speaking technical language, and underneath it all, the reflexive contempt that came from years of treating service workers as decorative furniture that occasionally moved. Jack felt the familiar weight of being perceived as presumptuous, of stepping outside the narrow box that his job description had constructed around his existence. He should apologize now, should laugh it off as confusion or overstepping, should retreat back into the comfortable silence of not mattering. But Chloe's face appeared in his mind, her eyes that watched him absorb disrespect like punishment he deserved, and something in his chest hardened against the easy surrender. "I'm trying to save you time and money, Mr. Whitfield," Jack said evenly, maintaining eye contact in a way that probably violated some unspoken rule about the proper behavior of subordinates. "That blade fracture is nearly invisible to the naked eye, but if you look at the third compressor stage with proper magnification, you'll see stress patterns that indicate metal fatigue. The engine won't fail catastrophically, the safety margins are too good for that, but it'll never maintain stable high-altitude combustion with that harmonic instability present." He spoke clearly and precisely, using technical language without translation or apology, letting years of self-taught expertise emerge like water through a cracked dam. The lead engineer was staring at him now with undisguised skepticism mixed with something that looked like professional curiosity, her tablet still glowing with diagnostic data that showed nothing wrong. She moved toward the engine compartment, pulling a high-powered inspection light and magnification tool from her kit, her movements deliberate and slightly defensive, as if Jack's certainty was a challenge rather than assistance. Whitfield's laugh came sharp and dismissive, the kind of laugh designed to restore social order through mockery, to put people back in their designated places through public humiliation. "You're just a driver," he said, voice loud enough for everyone in the hangar to hear, emphasizing the word driver like it was a punchline or an insult or both. "What do you know about turbine engines? Did you study them between picking me up from the office and waiting in the car?" The words were meant to sting, meant to make Jack remember his place, meant to re-establish the comfortable hierarchy where wealthy industrialists understood complex things and service workers understood nothing beyond their narrow functions. Jack felt the familiar heat of shame trying to rise in his chest, the trained response of someone who'd spent 5 years learning not to challenge, not to correct, not to demonstrate knowledge that might threaten the comfortable fictions that made his employment possible. But alongside that shame was something newer and sharper, anger, righteous and clean, at being treated like intelligence was a luxury reserved for people born into the right circumstances, as if expertise could only exist within certain tax brackets and job titles. "I studied them at MIT before my daughter was born," Jack said quietly, the words emerging without permission, breaking protocols he'd carefully maintained for half a decade. "Full scholarship for aerospace engineering, emphasis on propulsion systems. I dropped out 3 months into my first year because 18-year-olds make terrible fathers and infants don't care about your GPA." He watched Whitfield's face struggle to process this information, watched certainty crack just slightly around the edges as new data collided with comfortable assumptions. I've been reading aerospace journals and FAA technical publications in my spare time for 15 years. I might drive your car, Mr. Whitfield, but I understand engines better than most of the people you've hired to fix this one. The statement wasn't boastful or defensive, just factual, delivered with the calm of someone who'd stopped caring whether truth was convenient. The lead engineer had her magnification scope positioned now, peering into the compressor assembly with focused intensity, her body language shifting from skeptical to surprised, to something approaching alarmed recognition. "He's right," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of professional honesty that couldn't be denied even when it was inconvenient. "There's a hairline fracture here. I can barely see it even with magnification, but it's definitely present. The stress patterns are exactly what he described." She looked up from the scope, her eyes finding Jack's with new respect that felt strange and uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit after years of comfortable looseness. This is exactly the kind of failure that would cause intermittent high RPM instability without triggering standard diagnostic alerts. "How did you spot this from across the hangar?" Her question was genuine curiosity rather than challenge, the kind of professional-to-professional inquiry that recognized expertise regardless of the uniform it wore. Jack felt something shift in the hangar's atmosphere, felt the other engineers turning to look at him with reassessed attention, felt his invisibility cracking like ice under spring sun. Whitfield stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his usual confident expression replaced with something approaching confusion, as if reality had suddenly started speaking a language he didn't recognize. Jack thought about Chloe again, about the conversation they'd had last month when she'd asked why smart people did jobs that didn't use their intelligence, why her father drove cars when he could probably design them. He'd told her that intelligence wasn't currency in the world as it actually existed, that being smart didn't pay rent or buy groceries, that sometimes survival required making yourself smaller than your capabilities in exchange for stability and modest paychecks. But standing here, watching engineers confirm his diagnosis, watching his employer's certainty collapse into stuttering confusion, Jack wondered if he'd been teaching his daughter the wrong lesson, if survival at the cost of entire identities was actually living or just a slower form of disappearing. The question hung in the air like humidity, heavy and unanswerable, while mechanics moved with new urgency around the fractured turbine blade, while Whitfield struggled to reconcile the competent engineer standing before him with the invisible driver he'd barely noticed for 5 years, while Jack's hands trembled slightly with the adrenaline of being seen for the first time in longer than he could remember, and not being sure whether visibility was gift or curse, or simply the uncomfortable truth of existing fully in a world designed to keep certain people partial. The lead engineer, whose name Jack learned was Patricia Reeves, moved with practiced efficiency once his diagnosis was confirmed, calling her team into focused action around the compromised turbine blade. "We need to shut down this engine completely and swap out the entire third-stage compressor assembly," she said, her voice calm but urgent, already pulling up parts inventory on her tablet while 2 other engineers began carefully disconnecting sensor arrays. Jack stood at the periphery of this sudden activity, feeling strangely disconnected from his own intervention, like he'd spoken words in a language he'd forgotten he knew, and was now surprised by their meaning. Whitfield had retreated a few steps, his phone pressed against his ear as he made calls that sounded increasingly desperate, postponing meetings, rearranging schedules, explaining delays with the kind of controlled panic that came from watching carefully constructed plans dissolve despite unlimited resources. There was something almost satisfying about watching wealth confront its limitations, about seeing money prove insufficient against physical reality and mechanical truth, though Jack immediately felt guilty for the satisfaction, recognizing it as petty and beneath him. "How long have you been driving for Whitfield?" Patricia asked, not looking up from her tablet, but directing the question toward Jack with casual curiosity that felt unprecedented. like breaking an invisible rule about acknowledging service workers as people with histories and expertise. Jack hesitated, not sure how to answer, not sure if this conversation was real or some strange, stress-induced hallucination. 5 years? He said finally, his voice still carrying that strange quality of someone discovering he could speak after years of imposed silence. Since Chloe was 10 and I needed health insurance that covered her asthma medications consistently. Patricia nodded, making notes on her tablet, her fingers moving fast across the screen. And you've been keeping current with aerospace engineering the whole time? That's not hobby-level knowledge. You diagnosed a failure mode that took my team 3 hours to miss. The compliment felt foreign and uncomfortable, like praise in a language he'd once spoken fluently, but hadn't heard in so long that his ears had forgotten how to process it properly. Jack thought about the textbooks in his closet, about the late nights after Chloe went to bed when he'd read FAA technical bulletins and peer-reviewed papers about advanced propulsion systems, about blade metallurgy and computational fluid dynamics, and the evolving science of making metal fly through careful application of controlled violence. Knowledge doesn't expire just because you're not using it professionally, he said, surprising himself with the defensive edge in his voice. I never stopped being an engineer. I just started doing it in private, in spaces where it wouldn't threaten the job that keeps my daughter fed. Patricia looked at him then, really looked, her eyes carrying the weight of understanding that came from living in a world that wasted human potential with bureaucratic efficiency. That's criminal, she said bluntly, her voice sharp with anger that wasn't directed at him, but at the circumstances that had made him choose between expertise and survival. You should be designing these systems, not driving people to airports and diagnosing their failures from across hangars like some kind of aviation superhero. The younger engineers were working on the turbine now, carefully extracting the compromised blade assembly with the kind of reverent precision that expensive machinery demanded, their movements coordinated and professional despite the time pressure. Jack watched them work with the kind of hunger he'd trained himself not to feel, the longing for hands-on problem-solving that had been relegated to helping Chloe with science projects and occasionally fixing neighborhood cars in exchange for grocery money. Engineering had been more than a career path for him. It had been a way of seeing the world, of understanding how things worked at their most fundamental level, of finding beauty in the mathematics that governed everything from combustion to galaxies. Giving that up had felt like amputating part of his mind, like deliberately making himself dumber in exchange for the immediate needs of parenthood. And there were nights when he'd lie awake, wondering if Chloe would thank him for the sacrifice or resent him for the bitterness it had bred in the quiet spaces of his thoughts. Whitfield ended his call and approached Jack with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between embarrassment and curiosity, with underlying resentment at having his worldview disrupted by inconvenient competence from unexpected places. "Why didn't you ever mention you had this background?" he asked, and Jack heard genuine confusion in the question, as if it was truly mysterious why someone might not volunteer their qualifications when those qualifications were irrelevant to being treated as mobile furniture. Jack almost laughed but caught himself, not wanting to cross the line from helpful employee to insubordinate servant, still aware that tonight he needed to go home to Chloe with employment intact and dignity maintained in whatever fragile form it could survive. "You never asked, Mr. Whitfield," Jack said carefully, keeping his tone neutral and factual. "And honestly, my educational background doesn't impact my ability to drive safely and arrive on schedule. I didn't think it was relevant information for my employer to have." The words hung between them, polite on the surface but carrying layers of subtext that both men could feel even if only one would acknowledge them. Whitfield had the decency to look uncomfortable. his usual confident swagger diminished by the growing realization that he'd spent 5 years underestimating the man who drove his car, who waited patiently outside restaurants and offices, who'd been present but invisible for hundreds of conversations that assumed his incomprehension. "I pay you to drive," Whitfield said finally, his voice carrying defensive justification, as if needing to re-establish why the hierarchy between them was appropriate and natural. "That's the job you applied for. Transportation, not engineering consultation." Jack nodded, accepting this truth without agreement, recognizing that both things could be simultaneously accurate. He had applied to be a driver, and he was also an engineer whose expertise had just saved his employer several days and possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars in missed business opportunities. The fact that only one of these identities was compensated or acknowledged said more about the world's priorities than about Jack's actual value. Patricia had the replacement compressor assembly pulled from parts inventory now, a gleaming piece of precisely machined metal that would slot into the engine and restore its proper harmonic balance, would make flight possible again through the simple act of replacing compromised components with intact ones. "This will take about 90 minutes to install and test properly," she told Whitfield, her voice carrying the authority of someone stating non-negotiable facts. "We'll have you airborne before 6, but it'll be close." Whitfield nodded, making more calls, already recalculating his schedule around this new timeline, his crisis management instincts overriding any further conversation about the unexpected competence of his driver. Jack stood there watching engineers work, watching metal and expertise combine to solve problems through applied knowledge and careful hands, and felt a profound ache that he'd learned to ignore but never quite kill, the longing for work that mattered, for problems that required his full intelligence, for days that ended with the satisfaction of difficult things accomplished rather than the hollow relief of having remained appropriately invisible. Chloe would ask him tonight how his day was, and he'd have to figure out how to tell her that he'd been seen, really seen, for the first time in 5 years. And he still wasn't sure if that visibility had changed anything fundamental about the shape of their lives, or if it was just a momentary crack in the usual performance of service and silence. The replacement compressor assembly went in smoothly, Patricia's team working with the kind of coordinated efficiency that came from hundreds of similar repairs, their hands moving through familiar choreography, while Jack watched from a respectful distance that was no longer quite invisibility, but not quite belonging either. He'd become something strange and in between, acknowledged but not integrated, recognized but not redefined, a driver who happened to also be an engineer in the same way that buildings happen to also have foundations that no one looked at or thought about unless something went wrong. Whitfield had disappeared into the jet's cabin, making more calls, his voice carrying through the open door with fragments of business language that meant nothing to Jack, shareholders and quarterly projections and market positioning, the abstract mathematics of wealth that bore no relationship to the concrete mathematics of making engines breathe. The sun was lower now, painting the hangar in amber light that made everything look temporarily beautiful, and Jack thought about texting Chloe to say he'd be late, but decided against it, not wanting to make promises about timing that depended on turbine testing and other people's schedules. Patricia approached him, after supervising the installation, pulling off her work gloves with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd just solved a difficult problem through applied expertise. "That was good diagnosis," she said, her tone carrying professional respect that felt surreal coming from someone whose credentials were actually documented and compensated appropriately. Most engineers wouldn't have caught that fracture without detailed inspection. It's the kind of thing that usually only shows up after catastrophic failure or during scheduled maintenance teardowns. "How'd you spot it from that distance?" Jack shrugged, not sure how to explain the instinct that came from years of studying systems holistically rather than as collections of parts, from understanding engines as living things with personalities and moods rather than as mechanical assemblies that either worked or didn't. I wasn't looking for it specifically, he admitted, his words coming slowly as he tried to articulate something that felt more like intuition than analysis. But the way the other engineers were describing the failure pattern, intermittent instability, at high RPM without obvious sensor alerts, it suggested harmonic issues rather than discrete mechanical failure. And harmonic problems in turbines almost always trace back to blade irregularities, either in manufacturing tolerances or in-service degradation. Patricia nodded, processing this explanation with the kind of thoughtful attention that recognized expertise when it appeared in unexpected contexts. "You think about systems differently than most mechanics," she observed, her voice carrying curiosity rather than judgment. "Most technicians are trained to troubleshoot linearly, check fuel, check electrical, check mechanical components in sequence until something fails to meet specifications. You went straight to systemic interaction, to how components talk to each other, rather than whether individual parts were functioning correctly." Jack felt seen in a way that was both gratifying and uncomfortable, like having someone identify something about yourself that you'd stopped acknowledging out loud. "I studied design, not repair," he said quietly, the words feeling like confession. "Design engineering teaches you to think about systems as conversations, components, communicating through physics and mathematics, creating emergent behaviors that can't be predicted by just looking at individual specifications. That's probably why I diagnosed it differently. I was thinking about how the engine was supposed to work as a whole, not just checking whether parts were broken." Udal, one of the younger engineers, called Patricia back to supervise final connection checks, and she squeezed Jack's shoulder briefly before walking away, a gesture that was probably meant to be encouraging, but felt almost painful in its casual acknowledgement of his competence. Jack stood alone at the edge of the hangar, watching the day dim into early evening, watching his employer's crisis get resolved through expertise that no one would remember belonged to a driver, and felt the familiar weight of questions he'd been asking himself for 5 years. What was the point of knowledge that couldn't be used? What did expertise mean when it existed only in private moments and theoretical understanding? Was he still an engineer if the only engines he touched belonged to other people's emergencies? If his diagnosis was treated as surprising anomaly rather than expected competence? These questions didn't have comfortable answers, existed in the complicated space between practical necessity and deeper fulfillment. Between being a good father and being a whole person, Chloe texted him finally, "Home yet? Want me to start dinner?" And Jack felt the familiar tug of divided attention, the pull between this hangar where he'd accidentally revealed himself and home where he was simply Dad, uncomplicated and present. He typed back quickly, "Running late with Mr. Whitfield. Order pizza. My credit card is in the blue wallet. Love you." The response came immediately, just a heart emoji, but Jack could read volumes in that single symbol, understanding mixed with resignation, love complicated by the awareness that her father's time was never fully his own, that emergencies belonging to wealthy men somehow always mattered more than dinner conversations with 15-year-old daughters. He pocketed his phone and watched the engineers complete their final checks, watched diagnostic screens glow green with approval, watched systems come back online with the quiet hum of machinery remembering how to function correctly. There was satisfaction in watching a problem get solved, even vicariously, even from the margins. Proof that knowledge applied correctly could restore order, could make broken things whole again through careful intervention and precise understanding. The engine test came 20 minutes later, Patricia personally overseeing the startup sequence while everyone else cleared the immediate area, following safety protocols that treated running jet engines with appropriate respect. Jack watched from beside the sedan, technically back in his designated space, back in the role of driver waiting for his employer, but his attention was completely focused on the Gulf Stream as its engines powered up with increasing intensity. The sound was distinctive, a rising whine that climbed through octaves, building from low rumble to high-pitched scream as turbines spun faster, as combustion chambers heated to operational temperatures, as all the complex systems worked together in the orchestrated violence that made flight possible. Jack's trained ear tracked the sound quality, listening for the harmonic irregularity that had been present before, listening for the telltale oscillation that indicated instability, and feeling profound relief when the engine note stayed clean and steady, climbing smoothly through its power range without the stuttering hesitation that had grounded the jet earlier. Patricia gave a thumbs up to someone inside the cockpit, and the engines throttled back down, the test complete and successful, the problem solved through correct diagnosis and competent repair. Whitfield emerged from the cabin moments later, his expression carrying the relief of someone whose crisis had been resolved, whose important meeting would happen after all, whose world had been restored to its proper functioning through other people's expertise. He walked toward Jack with purpose, his stride carrying the confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether spaces were meant for him, whether his presence would be welcomed or tolerated or ignored. "Good catch on that blade," Whitfield said, and Jack heard something in his tone that might have been grudging respect or might have been the verbal equivalent of tipping service workers. Acknowledgement that was really just another form of dismissal. Recognition that reinforced hierarchy rather than challenging it. "Saved me a lot of time and hassle," Jack nodded, accepting the compliment without responding, not sure what words would be appropriate here, not sure if "you're welcome" was the right response when your expertise was being treated as lucky coincidence rather than professional competence. Whitfield seemed to struggle with something, his usual glib confidence faltering slightly, his face working through expressions that suggested internal debate about whether to say more or just move forward, pretending this had been a normal afternoon. "Look," he said finally, his voice carrying unfamiliar uncertainty, "I may have been dismissive earlier. When you first mentioned the engine issue, I didn't know about your background. The apology, such as it was, came wrapped in justification. I didn't know implied that dismissiveness was appropriate when directed at people whose credentials you hadn't verified, that contempt was fine as long as it was based on reasonable assumptions about service workers' limitations." Jack heard this subtext clearly, heard what Whitfield wasn't saying about class and assumptions and the casual cruelty that came from never having to imagine the interior lives of people you employed. "It's fine, Mr. Whitfield," Jack said, keeping his voice professionally neutral, not wanting to extend this conversation into territory that might threaten his employment or force uncomfortable honesty about their relationship. "Like you said, you pay me to drive. The engineering knowledge was just incidental." He watched his employer's face relax slightly at this easy absolution, at being released from whatever brief discomfort he'd felt about treating his driver as furniture that turned out to have advanced degrees hidden in its upholstery. They stood there for a moment in silence that felt loaded with things neither man wanted to articulate, about value and recognition, about intelligence that existed independent of job titles, about the strange violence of a world that made some people invisible and others blindingly important, based on accidents of birth and circumstance rather than actual capability or worth. Then Whitfield checked his watch, the moment broken by practical concerns, by schedules that needed maintaining and meetings that waited for no one regardless of philosophical epiphanies about human dignity. "We should head to the executive terminal. They're finishing the pre-flight now, and I need to be wheels up in 30 minutes, Whitfield said, already moving toward the sedan, already transitioning back into the familiar dynamic of employer and driver, important man and person who moved him from place to place. Jack followed, sliding back into the driver's seat that suddenly felt like a costume he was wearing, like a role he was performing rather than an identity he actually inhabited. The leather steering wheel was still warm from earlier, still worn smooth by 5 years of circular motion, and his hands gripped it with the automatic familiarity of practiced gesture, muscle memory, that required no conscious thought. They drove the short distance to the executive terminal in silence, Whitfield already absorbed in his phone, in emails and messages that demanded immediate attention, in the important work of being important that filled every available moment with urgent nothing. Jack watched the hangar disappear in his rearview mirror, watched Patricia and her team pack up their tools, watched the Gulfstream sit ready on the tarmac, like proof that problems could be solved through knowledge correctly applied, and felt a strange, hollow sadness that he couldn't quite name. Not regret exactly, but something adjacent to it, the peculiar grief of being briefly seen and then carefully not seen again, of mattering and then not mattering in the span of 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon that would be forgotten by everyone except him. The executive terminal was nearly empty, just a few other private travelers moving through spaces designed for minimal waiting and maximum efficiency, their expensive luggage trailing behind them on smooth wheels that probably cost more than Jack's monthly rent. He pulled the sedan into the departure area, and Whitfield gathered his briefcase and carry-on with practiced efficiency, already mentally in New York rather than here, already focused on merger negotiations and corporate strategy rather than the afternoon's mechanical crisis. "I'll call you when I land. Probably need pickup around midnight," Whitfield said, opening the door without looking back at Jack, his tone carrying the assumption of availability that came from employing people hourly, from knowing that their time was his to command regardless of personal plans or family dinners. Jack nodded, even though Whitfield couldn't see it, adding midnight pickup to his mental schedule, already texting Chloe that he wouldn't be home until late, already rearranging their evening from shared dinner to quick conversation before she went to bed, already making himself smaller to fit around other people's priorities. But something stopped Whitfield at the door, some impulse or thought that made him pause halfway out of the car, his body language suggesting internal debate about whether to speak or just leave things unexamined. He turned back toward Jack with an expression that was difficult to read. Vulnerability mixed with calculation, genuine curiosity fighting with the habitual distance he maintained from employees. "That MIT scholarship," Whitfield said slowly, his voice carrying actual interest rather than polite conversation. "Was it really full ride for aerospace engineering?" Jack felt the question like physical weight, felt all the history compressed into it, the dreams he'd folded away, the future he'd traded for immediate fatherhood, the parallel life he sometimes imagined on sleepless nights when Chloe's asthma flared up and he sat beside her bed, making sure she kept breathing. "Full tuition, room and board, plus research stipend," Jack confirmed, keeping his voice factual and unemotional, not wanting to color the information with the complicated feelings it carried. "I had professors from the aerospace department calling my high school principal personally to make sure I was coming. They saw my senior project, a scale model of a variable geometry turbine that could optimize blade pitch in real time based on altitude and temperature. Built it in my mom's garage with parts from junkyards and donated machine shop time." Whitfield's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise breaking through his usual controlled expression, and Jack realized his employer was actually listening rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. "So you were exceptional," Whitfield said. Not quite a question, more like confirmation of something he was trying to understand. "Not just smart. Actually exceptional enough that a top engineering program recruited you personally." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the characterization, even though it was objectively true, uncomfortable with discussing potential that had been deliberately abandoned for practical necessity. "Exceptional doesn't mean much when you have a 3-month-old daughter and no one else willing to care for her," he said quietly, the words coming out sharper than intended, carrying accumulated bitterness from 15 years of wondering what if. I made a choice. Maybe not the smart choice, maybe not the choice that optimized my personal potential, but the only choice that seemed possible when Chloe needed someone to show up every single day, regardless of calculus homework or research deadlines. The silence that followed felt dense and complicated, filled with the weight of paths not taken and futures that existed only in imagination, and Jack wondered if he'd said too much, if honesty about sacrifice would read as resentment to his employer, if acknowledging the cost of fatherhood meant he'd failed somehow to perform the expected gratitude of service workers who should be thankful for employment regardless of how it utilized or wasted their capabilities. Whitfield seemed to be processing something, his face working through expressions that suggested discomfort, with new information that didn't fit comfortably into his existing worldview. "And you've just been driving cars since then?" he asked. And Jack heard genuine confusion in the question, the inability to comprehend why someone with his credentials would choose such dramatically limited work, why genius would volunteer for invisibility. "Not since Chloe was born. I worked construction for a while, did some freelance CAD work, tried a few different things that paid hourly and didn't require college degrees or references from internships I never completed," Jack explained, his voice carrying the exhaustion of explaining choices that were really just survival strategies dressed up as decisions. The driving job was actually a step up, better benefits, more stable hours, working for someone wealthy enough that missing a paycheck because of sick days wasn't constant threat. Whitfield nodded slowly, and Jack could see him recalculating something, reassessing the man who'd been driving him for 5 years through this new lens of wasted potential and deliberately constrained brilliance. "Have you ever thought about going back?" Whitfield asked. And the question felt almost cruel in its naivety, in the casual assumption that going back was simply a matter of wanting it enough, of deciding that now was the right time to reclaim abandoned dreams. Jack almost laughed, but caught himself, not wanting to seem bitter or ungrateful, not wanting to jeopardize the careful stability he'd built from minimum wage and strategic self-erasure. "Every single day," he admitted, the honesty surprising him as much as his employer, the words emerging without the usual careful editing that kept his interior life private and protected. "But wanting something doesn't make it possible. Chloe still needs health insurance, still needs food and rent and school supplies, still needs a parent who shows up consistently rather than someone chasing degrees that might pay off in 4 years if everything goes perfectly and nothing unexpected happens." They sat there together in uncomfortable silence, employer and employee, wealthy man and service worker, two humans briefly acknowledging the strange violence of circumstance that had put them in such different positions despite potentially comparable intelligence. Whitfield's phone buzzed with what was probably an urgent message about his flight, but he ignored it, still looking at Jack with an expression that suggested he was trying to solve a problem he'd just discovered existed. "What if money wasn't the barrier?" Whitfield asked suddenly, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone for whom money was never actually a barrier to anything. "What if you had tuition covered, living expenses handled, health insurance maintained? Would you go back to school then? Would you finish what you started?" The question hung in the air like an offer, or maybe a test, and Jack felt his heart rate accelerate with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. His mind immediately calculating logistics and possibilities, and all the ways that charity from his employer could complicate or destroy the careful boundaries that made their relationship sustainable. "I can't accept money from you, Mr. Whitfield," Jack said carefully, his voice firm despite the internal screaming that wanted to say yes to anything that might make engineering possible again, that might give him back the identity he'd folded away like old clothes that no longer fit. "That would change our working relationship in ways that wouldn't be healthy for either of us, create obligations and expectations that would make the employer-employee dynamic untenable." Whitfield waved this concern away like smoke, like something insubstantial that dissolved under the force of his determination. I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about investment in talent that I've been underutilizing criminally for 5 years, he said, his business mind clearly working now, turning human complexity into the kind of problem he understood how to solve through resource allocation and strategic planning. You saved me probably $500,000 today by diagnosing that engine failure. That's not nothing. That's not some lucky guess from someone who happened to read a book once. That's professional-level expertise that has tangible value. Jack felt something shifting, some tectonic movement in the foundation of his carefully constructed life, and wasn't sure if the feeling was excitement or terror, or both simultaneously. Chloe's face appeared in his mind, older now at 15, aware of sacrifices he'd made, carrying guilt about being the reason her father had given up dreams she'd never asked him to abandon. What would she say if he came home tonight and told her that maybe, possibly, the path back to engineering was opening in front of him like a door that had been locked for 15 years suddenly swinging wide? Would she be happy for him? Would she feel like she'd finally been released from the invisible debt of his sacrifice? Or would she worry about stability, about the risk of change, about whether reaching for something better might somehow destroy the careful equilibrium they'd built from stubbornness and love and making do with less than everything? The questions spiraled without answers while Whitfield waited for response, while his phone buzzed again with increasing urgency, while the late afternoon sun painted the terminal in amber light that made everything look temporarily beautiful and possible and strange. Whitfield's flight was being called over the terminal intercom, the polite mechanical voice announcing final boarding with increasing urgency, but he seemed in no hurry to leave, his attention focused completely on Jack in a way that felt unprecedented and slightly uncomfortable. "Think about it," Whitfield said, his tone carrying genuine interest rather than the performative concern of people making conversation they didn't mean. "I'm serious about this. I have connections at Northwestern's engineering department, some board positions that come with scholarship discretion. We could make this happen if you actually wanted it. Not as charity, but as correction of a market inefficiency, if you want to think about it in business terms." He smiled slightly at his own phrasing, clearly pleased with himself for finding language that made generosity sound like strategic investment, that allowed both men to pretend this was about optimizing resource allocation rather than acknowledging the fundamental injustice of wasted human potential. Jack felt his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel, felt adrenaline flooding his system in response to possibility opening like a crack in a dam he'd spent 15 years reinforcing. "I need to think," Jack managed, his voice not quite steady, his mind already racing through logistics and impossibilities. How would he balance classes and Chloe's needs? How would they survive on reduced income during the years of study? What if he failed after all this time, away from formal academics? What if getting his hopes up again just made the inevitable disappointment more painful when reality reasserted itself? Whitfield nodded, gathering his briefcase and carry-on with renewed purpose now that his offer was made, now that he'd done his good deed and could move forward, feeling magnanimous and enlightened. "Take your time. We can talk more when I'm back from New York." "But Jack..." He paused at the door, looking back with an expression that was harder to read than his usual confidence. "You're wasted as a driver. I should have seen that years ago, should have asked questions, should have treated you like a person with a history instead of just a function in my schedule. That's on me." The apology, such as it was, came wrapped in self-criticism that somehow still centered Whitfield's experience and growth rather than Jack's years of being invisible. But Jack appreciated it anyway, appreciated any acknowledgement that he'd been unseen and that the unseeing had been a failure of attention rather than accurate assessment of his worth. Then Whitfield was gone, moving through the terminal toward his waiting jet, toward his important meeting and his life of consequence, leaving Jack alone in the sedan with thoughts that felt too big for the enclosed space. with possibility that didn't know how to fit inside the careful limitations he'd constructed around his existence. He sat there for several minutes after Whitfield disappeared, hands still on the steering wheel, heart still racing, mind cycling through scenarios and calculations, and the terrifying question of whether he was brave enough to reach for something better, or if he'd become so accustomed to making do with less that actually having more would feel like a costume that didn't fit. Like pretending to be someone he'd stopped being so long ago that returning to that identity felt like performance rather than authentic self. His phone buzzed. Chloe again, asking if she should wait up or just go to bed. Her text carrying the resigned understanding of someone who'd learned not to expect her father's presence at any particular time, who'd adapted to the reality that wealthy employers' schedules took precedence over family dinners and bedtime conversations. Jack started the car, pulling out of the executive terminal and heading toward home, toward Chloe and the conversation he suddenly needed to have with her. The conversation he'd been avoiding for 15 years about who he'd been before she was born and who he might become again if he was brave enough to try. If circumstances aligned, if the universe was kind enough to give second chances to people who'd made necessary sacrifices the first time around. The drive home took 40 minutes through evening traffic, and Jack used the time to rehearse words that never sounded right, to practice explaining Whitfield's offer without making it sound like Chloe had been a burden or a mistake, without implying that the 15 years he'd spent being her father were years he regretted or wanted back, without accidentally communicating that engineering mattered more than she did. The truth was more complicated than that. He loved being her father, loved Chloe with an intensity that still sometimes surprised him. But he'd also lost something fundamental when he'd folded away his MIT acceptance letter, had amputated part of himself to make room for the practical necessities of single fatherhood. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been nice once, maybe 30 years ago, before deferred maintenance and absentee landlords had turned it into the kind of place where ambitious people lived temporarily while waiting for something better. Jack climbed the stairs slowly, his legs heavy with more than physical fatigue, his mind still cycling through impossible calculations about tuition and time, and whether reconstruction of abandoned identities was actually possible or just another form of fantasy. Chloe was in the living room when he entered, curled up on their worn couch with textbooks spread around her like evidence of the serious student she'd become, her asthma inhaler sitting on the side table within easy reach the way it always was, constant reminder of her fragility and his responsibility. She looked up when he entered, her expression immediately concerned because apparently his face was communicating something his words hadn't yet articulated. "What happened?" she asked, closing her chemistry textbook and giving him her full attention in the way that always made Jack ache with love and guilt simultaneously. She was so good at reading him, so attuned to his moods and unspoken distress, skills she'd developed from years of being raised by someone who carried unprocessed grief about abandoned futures. "Something strange," Jack said, sitting down beside her on the couch, suddenly exhausted by the day's emotional weight, by being seen and then offered transformation like it was simple, like the past 15 years were just a temporary detour rather than the permanent reorganization of his entire life trajectory. Mr. Whitfield's jet broke down today, engine trouble. The mechanics couldn't figure it out. He watched Chloe's face as he spoke, watched her process information and arrive at conclusions with the quick intelligence she'd inherited from him, or maybe developed in response to being raised by someone who valued thinking clearly above almost everything else. "And you fixed it," she said. Not quite a question, more like confirmation of something she'd already intuited from his expression and the way he was sitting with his shoulders curved inward, like he was protecting something fragile in his chest. "You did the engineer thing, didn't you? The thing you always tell me you used to be good at before I was born." Jack flinched at the phrasing, before I was born, hearing in it all the guilt he'd tried so hard not to transfer to his daughter, all the unspoken message that she'd cost him something important even though he'd never, ever wanted her to feel responsible for choices that were his alone to make. I diagnosed a hairline turbine fracture that the professional mechanics missed, he confirmed, his voice careful and measured, trying to keep emotion out of facts that were inherently emotional. It was strange, being seen as competent at something other than driving, being recognized as someone who understands complex systems instead of just someone who moves people from place to place. Chloe reached over and took his hand, her fingers small but strong, her touch grounding him in present reality rather than hypothetical futures. "What did Mr. Whitfield say?" she asked, and Jack heard the real question underneath. Did he finally see you? Did he finally understand what he's been wasting? Did he apologize for treating you like you're invisible? "He offered to help me go back to school," Jack said, the words feeling surreal even as he spoke them, like describing a dream he'd had rather than a conversation that actually happened. "Said he has connections at Northwestern, could arrange scholarship and living expenses, wants to optimize underutilized resources, or however rich people say they've realized they've been criminally wrong about someone for 5 years. He tried to keep bitterness out of his voice, but didn't quite succeed. The accumulated weight of being unseen suddenly pressing down harder now that he'd been briefly visible. He said I'm wasted as a driver, that he should have asked questions, should have treated me like a person with a history." Chloe was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious thoughtfulness she brought to complicated problems, her face working through expressions that Jack recognized from his own mirror. Hope fighting with skepticism, possibility colliding with practical concerns about risk and change, and whether things that sounded too good to be true usually were. "Do you want to go back?" Chloe asked finally, her voice small but steady, carrying the weight of someone asking a question they weren't sure they wanted answered honestly. Jack looked at his daughter, 15 years old and far too aware of sacrifices he'd tried to make invisible, far too conscious of being the reason her father had folded away entire potential futures. She had his eyes, people always said, but he saw her mother in the set of her jaw, in the stubborn determination that had let her thrive despite growing up with less money and fewer advantages than most of her classmates. "I don't know," Jack admitted, the honesty feeling both liberating and terrifying, like exposing something he'd kept protected for so long that vulnerability had become foreign language. "Part of me has wanted to go back every single day since I dropped out, has wondered what I could have become, what problems I could have solved, whether I'd be happier doing work that actually used my brain instead of just my ability to navigate traffic and maintain professional silence." He paused, choosing his next words carefully, aware that this conversation would shape how Chloe understood her own impact on his life, how she processed the complicated legacy of being deeply loved, but also slightly expensive in terms of abandoned alternatives. "But another part of me knows that dropping out was the right choice, the only choice, really. You needed a parent who showed up every day, who prioritized your health and safety and development over personal ambitions and hypothetical futures. I don't regret choosing you, Chloe. I've never regretted that." He squeezed her hand, making sure she could feel the sincerity in his grip, the physical manifestation of emotional truth that words sometimes failed to carry completely. "But I'm allowed to grieve what I lost, even while loving what I gained. Both things can be true simultaneously. I can be grateful for being your father and still mourn the engineer I might have become if circumstances had been different." Chloe's eyes were bright with tears she wasn't letting fall, her face carrying the complicated expression of someone processing guilt they hadn't earned, but carried anyway. The legacy of children who understood too early that their parents had sacrificed for them in ways that left permanent marks on everyone involved. "You should go back," she said finally, her voice wavering but determined, carrying conviction that surprised Jack with its strength. "Dad, you should absolutely go back to school and finish what you started. Not because Mr. Whitfield suddenly realized you're smart, not because rich people finally noticed your wasted driving cars, but because you deserve it. Because you've spent 15 years making yourself smaller so I could have what I needed. And maybe now it's time to let yourself be big again, to use your actual brain on actual problems that matter. Her words came faster now, tears finally spilling over as years of observation and understanding poured out in sentences that hurt to hear because they were so accurate, so seeing of everything Jack had tried to hide from her. I've watched you help me with science projects like they're the most important thing in the world, even though I know you're solving problems in your head that are way more complicated than whether vinegar and baking soda react properly. Chloe continued, her voice breaking slightly but pushing forward anyway. I've seen the books in your closet, the aerospace engineering textbooks you think I don't know about, the journal articles you read on your phone when you think I'm not paying attention. You're still an engineer, Dad. You never stopped being one. You just stopped getting to do it professionally, stopped getting recognized and compensated for it. And that's wrong. That's so deeply wrong that I sometimes want to scream at the universe for wasting you like this. She wiped at her eyes impatiently, frustrated by tears that interrupted her momentum. So yes, go back to school. Take Mr. Whitfield's offer or find another way, but please, please don't turn down this chance because you think you owe me some kind of debt for being born. I didn't ask you to sacrifice everything. I never wanted that. Jack felt his own tears starting, his carefully maintained composure cracking under the force of his daughter's fierce advocacy for his deferred dreams, under the realization that his sacrifice had been visible all along, despite his efforts to hide its cost. "What about you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he usually kept contained. "What about your health insurance, your school expenses? What if I fail and we end up worse off than we started? What if reaching for something better just breaks what we've managed to build from stubbornness and making do?" Chloe laughed through her tears, a sound that was half sob and half genuine amusement. "Dad, you diagnosed a hairline fracture in a jet turbine from across a hangar after 5 years of not touching aerospace engineering professionally. You didn't forget how to be brilliant. You just got really good at hiding it. You're not going to fail. And even if you struggled at first, even if it was hard, wouldn't that still be better than spending the rest of your life wondering what you could have been?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and possibilities and the terrifying prospect of change after years of careful stability. Jack thought about MIT, about the professors who'd called his high school personally, about the variable geometry turbine he'd built in his mother's garage with salvaged parts and borrowed machine time. He thought about Patricia's expression when she'd confirmed his diagnosis, about the respect in her voice when she'd called his knowledge more than hobby level, about the strange feeling of being seen as an engineer rather than just a driver who happened to know things. He thought about Whitfield's offer, about Northwestern's engineering department, about whether it was possible to reclaim identities you'd folded away, or if too much time had passed, if he'd become so accustomed to being practical and invisible that returning to ambitious and recognized would feel like wearing someone else's clothes. "I'm scared," Jack admitted finally, the confession feeling both shameful and necessary, the kind of honesty that children deserved from parents who'd asked them to be brave through circumstances neither of them chose. "I'm scared of hoping for something better and having it fall apart. I'm scared of changing our lives in ways that might not work. I'm scared that I've been a driver for so long that I've forgotten how to be anything else, that the engineer I was at 23 is just gone now, replaced by someone who's learned to fit inside smaller spaces." Chloe shifted on the couch, pulling Jack into a hug that felt like role reversal, like the child comforting the parent, like love moving in directions that defied simple categories of caretaking and dependency. "Being scared makes sense," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled but clear. "Being scared means it matters, means you're risking something important. But Dad, You've been scared for 15 years about different things. Scared about my asthma, scared about making rent, scared about what would happen if you got sick or lost your job or couldn't keep all the careful pieces of our lives balanced perfectly. She pulled back to look at him directly, her eyes red from crying, but fierce with determination that reminded Jack of himself at her age, of the stubborn conviction that had gotten him full scholarships and professor attention, and a future that had seemed inevitable before life had reminded him that inevitability was just another word for privilege he didn't quite have. Maybe this time, Chloe said slowly, maybe this time you could be scared of something that might actually make you happy, instead of just scared of things that might hurt us. Maybe you could take a risk on yourself instead of always taking risks to protect me. Maybe we could both be brave together and see what happens when you stop making yourself small. Her words hit like physical impact, like truth delivered with the kind of clarity that only comes from people who love you enough to see past the stories you tell yourself, who understand the difference between necessary sacrifice and unnecessary martyrdom, who believe in your potential even when you've spent years convincing yourself that potential expired when dreams got deferred past their sell-by date. Jack held his daughter close, feeling the familiar weight of her against his chest, feeling the responsibility that had defined his adult life, but now also feeling something new. Permission, maybe, or recognition that caretaking could look like different things at different times, that being a good father might sometimes mean showing his daughter that dreams deferred didn't have to mean dreams dead. That intelligence and potential could survive 15 years of deliberate underutilization if you were willing to be brave enough to reclaim them. Okay, he said quietly, the word feeling momentous despite its simplicity, feeling like a promise and a commitment and a terrifying leap toward futures that existed only in possibility rather than guaranteed safety. Okay, I'll call Mr. Whitfield tomorrow. I'll talk to Northwestern. I'll figure out logistics and timelines and whether this can actually work, but Chloe, he pulled back to look at her seriously, needing her to understand this completely. If we do this, it's going to be hard. It's going to mean less money initially, more stress, me being distracted by homework and exams, and probably failing sometimes before I figure out how to be a student again. Are you sure you're ready for that? Chloe smiled through her tears, her expression carrying pride and love and the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been advocating for something important and finally been heard. Dad, I've been ready for you to be yourself again since I was old enough to understand that you'd been pretending to be smaller than you were. I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be whole. And you can't be whole if you keep hiding half of who you are inside closets with aerospace textbooks you think I don't know about. She laughed softly, the sound carrying relief and anticipation and the complicated hope that comes with embracing change after years of careful stasis. Besides, I'm pretty sure having an actual aerospace engineer as a father will make my college applications way more interesting than having a driver, even if you're a driver who secretly knows everything about turbine harmonics and computational fluid dynamics. They sat together on the worn couch in their third-floor apartment, father and daughter, two people who'd built a life from limited resources and stubborn love, contemplating futures that had seemed impossible hours ago but now felt tentatively, terrifyingly possible. Jack thought about the Gulf Stream on the tarmac, about engines that sang when properly balanced and screamed when fractured, about how systems worked best when all their components were allowed to function at their designed capacity rather than being artificially constrained. He thought about calling Whitfield tomorrow, about conversations with Northwestern admissions, about studying again after 15 years away from formal academics, about whether his mind would remember how to learn at the pace and depth that universities demanded. He thought about Chloe, watching him study, about modeling for her what it looked like to reach for deferred dreams, even when the reaching felt presumptuous or impossible, about teaching her through action rather than words that intelligence had value independent of immediate economic utility, that becoming who you were meant to be mattered even when the path wasn't straight or simple or guaranteed to work. Outside their window, Chicago stretched into evening darkness, the skyline glittering with lights that represented other people's lives and choices and carefully constructed futures. Jack had spent 5 years driving through that skyline, carrying wealthy passengers to important destinations, while his own destination remained perpetually deferred, perpetually waiting for the right time that never quite arrived. But maybe, he thought, holding Chloe close and feeling something like hope unfurling carefully in his chest, maybe the right time was just whenever you decided to stop waiting, whenever you got brave enough to claim space you'd been told wasn't meant for people like you, whenever you let yourself be seen completely instead of performing whatever partial identity felt safest. The jet engine had been fixed through accurate diagnosis and correct intervention, through someone being willing to see what others had missed and speak truth that needed speaking. Maybe lives worked the same way. Maybe they could be repaired through honesty and courage and willingness to stop performing invisibility, through recognition that broken things could be made whole again if you were willing to do the work of restoration, if you believed that wholeness mattered enough to risk the comfortable brokenness you'd learned to live with. Jack didn't have answers yet, didn't know how this story would end, or whether engineering school would work, or whether he'd succeed at reclaiming the identity he'd folded away 15 years ago. But sitting there with Chloe, feeling her belief in him like physical warmth, Jack thought that maybe not knowing was okay. Maybe uncertainty was just another name for possibility. Maybe being brave meant starting anyway despite all the questions that couldn't be answered in advance. Tomorrow he'd make phone calls, would investigate logistics, would take first steps toward futures that existed only as potential rather than plan. Tonight, he'd simply sit with his daughter and let himself imagine being whole again, being seen completely, being Jack Lawson, the aerospace engineer, instead of Jack the driver, and discovering whether the man who'd fixed the jet engine that stumped all the engineers was still alive inside him, waiting all these years not to be rescued, but simply to be remembered, to be acknowledged. To be given permission to exist again, not despite being a father, but because being a father had taught him that love sometimes meant being brave enough to become yourself completely, to show your daughter through lived example that potential deferred was not the same as potential destroyed, and that second chances were real if you were willing to reach for them, with hands that had learned to grip steering wheels, but had never forgotten the weight of wrenches and the poetry of equations that made impossible things fly. The night settled around them with the particular quiet of decisions made and futures opened, and Jack felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Not hope exactly, but something closer to it. Something that tasted like possibility and looked like his daughter's fierce belief reflected back at him, reminding him that being seen completely was terrifying and necessary, and perhaps the only way to teach the next generation that intelligence mattered, that dreams deferred could be dreams reclaimed, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stop making yourself small and let yourself be exactly as brilliant as you'd always been. Turbine diagnostics and MIT scholarships, and all the complicated glory of refusing to disappear just because the world had stopped looking for you in the places where you'd learned to hide.